we have folks from all different experiences, or at least amounts of experience with hunting for morels. And so we figure, hey, let's tell folks that are relatively new to the club a few things about hunting morels. Um, so I'm just going to go ahead and jump off. Sorry if this is a little bit of rehash from a few years ago. I, we did have a little talk like this back then. And so I've kind of used some of those slides and added in a few different ones. Um, there. Okay. So anyway, first off, the signs of spring. You can see actually it's my background here too, but one of the signs of spring you may see is some folks traipsing through the woods off trail. That's a pretty common sign this time of year. Oftentimes you'll also see cars parked along the side of the road. And you're like, oh, what are those people doing? But some of the real signs of spring that you might be seeing all over the place. So some of these that I'm going to talk about are kind of helpful in maybe finding where they are. Sometimes it's more like a timing. When I first started, people used to talk about the forsythia. I have not found that forsythia is necessarily timing when it comes to morels, but as you can see in this picture, you've also got the cherry trees happening. So when you've got your cherry blossom festival, you know morels are right around the corner. And oftentimes you'll see these yellow blooms with this forsythia that are also blooming all over the place. Um, Another one that is often talked about is this eastern redbud, and I imagine you guys are starting to see these blooming all over the place. Um, I was going to try and get a picture on Sunday at work, and that redbud was hardly flowering out yet. It had the basic starts of buds, and today it looked almost more like this. So it's happened very fast. Red buds are, some people talked about red buds when they're flowering, they're out, but I think that they flower, it's variable. So you're not necessarily going to time it just right with the morels. But anyway, that's another good sign when you see the red buds blooming. You know, you should at least start thinking about going to go walk in the woods. Couple of smaller plants that are good signs of the woods that you're walking in. And so if you go into a forest and you see these May apples, it may not mean that morels are there. I don't. I've only found one or two morels actually under May apples, um, but it's a good sign that there is moisture and the ground stays moist. And it's the same with the one here on the right, which is spicebush. Um, and you can find them near spicebush, but I think spicebush is more of a indicator that the ground there stays moist. It has probably similar nutrient needs, or at least likes living in the similar soils. Um, Spicebush is smells amazing. One of my first morel hunts, we were out in 4-H center, and I I lost the group and was trying to barrel through a bunch of stuff to find them again, and started breaking branches of these bushes I was walking through, and just this very fragrant, really nice smelling smell. And I was like, oh my gosh, what is this? It's amazing. Um, and they may not quite have the berries on them yet, but you'll see the leaves. They often grow in clusters, and apparently the settlers used allspice berries as a kind of substitute of allspice. So you can try that if you want. So the May apples, um, some people have said when they get about a foot tall, some people say that you can see these are kind of flattened out, and when they first start, they're kind of like hanging down. That's too early, and so once they start flattening out, you're probably going to have a better chance. But again, not necessarily exactly, but you know that's good conditions if you've got some May apples up. So I kind of threw the pennywort in there because I was looking at it on my phone and I thought it was this one on the right, the showy orchid, which I know I've let the Morel take the starring role in that picture. Um, but pennywort is another one that's flowering at the same time. And it's kind of cool because this is actually a plant that seems to have at least some sort of um, association with mycorrhiza in the soil. And so this is a mycoheterotroph, at least partially. So it's not like your ghost pipes where there's no chlorophyll. This one actually does have chlorophyll, um, but it also taps nutrients out of these mycorrhizal associations. So it may be kind of hard to see what the flowers look like since I let the Morel take the, well, be the star of this picture, but they have very distinct, almost thick looking, lush leaves. They're beautiful flowers, and they tend to be flowering around the same time. And so showy orchids are a very good sign that if they're blooming, a good sign that morels are also up. All right, next I'm going to go into a few trees that you can look out for. So I didn't mention it when I first started, but you see the background behind me, and this is a little bit earlier in the year, um, but when you are looking for morel woods, this is probably a little bit later, and so you're seeing a lot more greenery growing. Oftentimes, when you find really lush morel, happy morel areas, there isn't much underbrush, and as we're about to see, the tulip poplars have larger leaves and they drop those, and it almost looks like a paper mache covering around the ground. And that is just the perfect area as those nutrients are leaching out of those leaves. It also blocks out some of this underbrush and the greenery that may kind of obscure finding the mushrooms. But anyway, this one is a little bit later in the year, but this is a good morel habitat. Also, I'm about to start talking about trees, which is not my wheelhouse. We have had some really good tree ID walks. Matt and Bradley have led a couple of those, and they both do a great job. They're really informative, and so I would definitely suggest going on trying out some of the tree ID walks if you hadn't, because it is good to know your trees when you start looking for mushrooms. All right, first one and probably the main player. I should also say this kind of talk is a little bit more focused on our area. If you go further south, things may change up. But for our area, these are some of the best things to be looking for. Tulip poplars. So it has kind of this cross-hatched bark. Oftentimes you see these white patches in the center, in the ridges or in the pits of the bark, which I believe is a lichen. Um, and they have these larger leaves once they're mature. I say they kind of look like a t-shirt. If you look at this one here, like this is the arms and here's the bottom of the shirt. I guess you could kind of look like a hand too. Anyway, I say it kind of looks like a t-shirt. Um, these have a lighter color leaf. And right now, if you go and driving down the highway or near work and there's some woods around, if you look at the top, so tulip poplars tend to have leaf out up towards the top. They don't have very many branches towards the bottom in general. And so I've heard some people say when they get the leaves are starting to leaf out and they're about the size of a mouse ear. Also, I've heard about the size of a $50. I would say probably more closer to a $50 is when you probably want to start looking. But oftentimes when you see them, they stand out, and you can see that, and they are in like groves, and so you can see that's a nice spot right over there. There's a whole bunch of tulip poplars. Let's go check there. And so they host a number of different morels, most commonly the deliciosa type. So anyway, that's tulip poplars. I didn't mention it, but if anybody has questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat. Also, if anybody on the board that can unmute, if you have any other things to say, just chime on in. All right. Next, we've got white ash. These are, for me, much easier to identify by the bark because they have very, very deeply furrowed bark. You can see how deep these are, and some of them are even deeper furrows than this. They can sometimes be almost cuboid. There are a number of ash too. This happens to be white ash. They have compound leaves, and so when the leaf falls, this whole chunk falls, not each one of these separate leaflets. So unfortunately, you will see these nowadays, and many of these chunks of bark are falling off. Sometimes the bark is all peeling off. They're dying because of the emerald ash borer. And so our ash trees are getting wiped out. I have heard that the stumps are starting to sprout new growth. And so we'll see if they can kind of recover. But unfortunately, these were really good to find morels under, and they stand out when you see their bark when they're mature like this. And another, probably one of the most common ones that you hear people talking about when trying to look for morels is the American elm tree and other elms. And so the bark of the elm tree tends to have more stringy looking bark. It also tends to be a bit corky. So if you take your fingernail and you kind of push on it, it's fairly easy to compress. They have their roots are kind of poking out and fluted. So they're not just flush with the ground. Oftentimes they'll have these like kind of fluted roots going into the ground. If you see one that's actually alive, because again, the Dutch elm disease wiped out a lot of our elm trees, there's still some saplings that are trying to make it, and then they succumb. And oftentimes when you do find these, either they're very sick or they're completely just a trunk just standing there with the bark falling off. That's okay, because even years later, sometimes the morels will pop out under them. You never know what's going to happen each year. One of the slides towards the end, it was under what I think were some pretty much just dead trunks poking out of the ground. So the leaves are kind of oval shaped with a point on the tip. And if you can see this, they actually kind of have this double serration on them. So they have one serration, but the serrations have serrations. So oftentimes they don't have many leaves, but you can usually see at least a couple coming out around the time you'd be hunting. So another couple that are less common to look for, but I have found a number of morels, a good number of morels under mixed tulip poplar sycamore along a riverbed. So that could be a possibility. I've heard that other people find them just under sycamores. I don't know many areas with a lot of cottonwoods, so I'm not very familiar with cottonwood, but apparently that is another common place that you can find them. People have said, I think more further south, that you can actually find them under conifer as well. And of course, on the West Coast, you're going to have like Burnside morels and things like that, but we don't really have that on this coast. And finally, another one that you may hear about is old abandoned apple orchards. I haven't really hunted myself under old abandoned apple orchards. I kind of don't know where. I mean, I guess if I really put my head down to the ground and tried, I could find some old abandoned orchards. But then you've got to think about what was happening ages ago when they were trying to get rid of the pests. And they were using this arsenic pesticide, which is really like a heavy metal. And so it doesn't break down and it doesn't leach out of the soil. And if they use a lot of that and it happens to be in the soil, the mushrooms can actually bioaccumulate that. So you can be eating morels and not even realize that you're eating arsenic as well with them. So this is kind of one of the reasons I've tried to avoid going to apple orchards. But people apparently have a lot of good luck going to them. All right, on to the actual mushrooms. So I'm going to start with the true morels, and I've lined them up like this to kind of give you an idea of when, in general, they fruit. And so typically the black morels will come up kind of first, and then you might start seeing some half-free morels, and then the tulip poplar morels, and then typically the larger Esculenta type or the Americana now are the last to come up. Uh, of course, there's a lot of overlap. I found the Esculenta type with perfectly happy black morels at the same time. So there's a lot of overlap, but it's just a general rule that's kind of how they work. So if you're finding black morels or you're finding yellows at a certain place, if you go up the mountain, you might find the black morels because it's a little cooler up there and the things are going to fruit later there. All right, so black morels, and this is just giving you some ideas of how to identify them. So the black morels can be confusing because, a lot of people see the yellow morels or the tulip poplar morels, and they have these dark, dark pits. And people are like, oh, that must be a black morel because it's so dark. But it actually depends on how the coloration of the ridges and the pits. And so black morels tend to have these darker ridges. And you can see that the pits are a bit lighter. So when you cut them in half, all morels, all true morels, are completely hollow. They kind of have these kind of bumpy, pimply stuff on the inside. And here's just a couple of different flavors of what they may look like. When they first start out, this dark coloration is not as pronounced, and they may look a little, almost a greenish color, almost kind of like this one before it starts actually turning to this black coloration. And as they mature, they'll get a little bit darker on the ridges. Okay, moving on to the half-free morels. So the reason why they're called half-free is because they have an overhanging or a partially overhanging cap. So oftentimes you'll see like this, so the cap is all part of this point here. Sometimes you'll even see it poke out here and connect again. So you'll have another little triangle of the cap. So this probably isn't as common as you usually see them because you've got this little triangle of cap where it's all completely hollow. There's no tissue crossing over here. Again, it's completely hollow. Often these have these darker ridges and lighter colored pits. They can be very small or they can be quite large. I think I've found one probably a foot tall and the base was, like Coke can size or something. It got skinny at the top, but the base was really big. And so they have a variety of shapes. The stem or the stipe tends to be much more brittle on these. And when you dry them, it gets almost papery. In my estimation, these are not some of my favorites to eat, but they are still good. They don't have quite as much flavor. I actually think I prefer the black morels to all the rest of them, although the yellows and the blacks are similar. All right, moving on to the tulip poplar morels. This is probably one of the more common ones we find, at least close to here, close to the DC area. And so this one has, you can see how the ridges on this one are extremely light. And the pits on these are very dark. Not always the case when you look at these. These are almost concolorous. And the dark coloration is actually more the shadow than actual coloration of the tissue. And they can have different forms almost. Like this actually kind of looks like almost three different forms to me. Sometimes you'll find them and they're very, very dark with almost white ridges. Sometimes they're all just super yellow. But the one thing about the tulip poplar, the diminutiva types, they are always, well, I guess I shouldn't say always, because you can also find smaller of the esculenta or the americana types. Um, but typically, these are a much smaller stature. They tend to have irregular, longitudinally arranged ridges. And so you can see these kind of go up and down the actual cap, and they're irregular. By the way, I guess I should mention, morels are ascomycetes. So these pits are actually where the spores are being produced. Uh, and you'll see when you cut this one in half, it's also pure hollow. And I kind of like this picture because I have gotten this in the past. And so when you're out there picking your mushrooms, uh, check for little holes in the stipe or the stem because sometimes the ants have gone in there and made a little nest. And I know I've picked them and brought them home and you cut them in half and it's full of ants and you're like, oh my gosh, what's going on? And so, and I guess this also brings up another point is you see this mushroom. If you're actually hunting for the pot morels, don't put them in your bag like this. Chop that little piece of dirt off because you imagine if this goes in the other way around, here you are having this little dirt clod bumping up against this mushroom that you're planning on eating later, and you just got grit and sand all of your mushrooms. So if you're out there, take your time, chop that little piece of dirt off. I actually cut mine at the base. I don't pull the dirt clod out. So I cut it at the base and then I'll try and brush off any of that extra dirt before I put it in my mouth. All right, on to the Americana type. And so they used to call these esculentas. And these tend to be much larger. They're large enough where you can actually stuff them because they're hollow. And they have very much more irregular, not necessarily longitudinally arranged. You can see on this one, there's no lines you can follow from top to bottom here. This one may have a few, but it's still very, very irregular compared to the diminutiva type. These also have the darker pits, which in some cases it may be more of the shadow, but they always have these lighter ridges. All right, so these also, when it comes to elm trees, when you find a good fruiting, oftentimes it is the Morchella americana, and they can fruit in abundance sometimes. They don't necessarily have a mycorrhizal. It may be a non-obligatory mycorrhizal association, or they might be feeding off these decaying roots as they die. I don't think anybody's definitively shown that they actually have a mycorrhizal association. The elms. All right, so on to some of the lookalikes. Now, these are not very common in our area, but it's good to know about them. This is Verpa conica. Conica tends to have a much smoother cap than the next one I'm going to show you. It can have some wrinkles in it, but you'll see once you see the next one, it's very different. The two main ways to distinguish these from actual morels. I think the Verpa conica would be fairly easy just looking at the shape of the cap. It doesn't really have very distinct ridges. It's much more smooth. And I've only found these a couple times, and that was out at the 4-H center. But you can see that these have an overhanging skirt-like cap. And so the tissue comes right across the top, and you've got this huge overhang. And the other thing is when you cut these in half, there's this mycelial, cottony mycelial filling inside them. And so you think you found a half-free, because this looks more like a half-free, and you cut it in half, you go, oh no, this is a verpa, this isn't a half-free. I haven't heard much about people eating Conica. People do eat Bohemica, but I've also heard that it can have some toxins in it. So I don't recommend eating the verpas myself, but I'm pretty sure that the next one, Bohemica, has been eaten quite a bit. So Verpa Bohemica, I can see why people would confuse this with a Morel. It looks very similar. The first time I went looking for morels, I happened to be in Washington State for work, and I knew that they found them there, and so I decided to go walking in the afternoon once I was done with my work, and I found something, and it looked very much like this. I was like, "Oh boy, I think I found one! I think I found one!" And I cut it in half, and sure enough, it was full of cottony filling. So like, oh, I guess I found my first Verpa instead of my first Morel. So anyway, Verpa Bohemica has a much more brainy-like, uh, wavy pits and ridges, kind of, and they are also sort of longitudinally arranged. But if you cut them in half, you'll see that cap is not attached. The base of the cap is not attached back to the stipe or stem at all. And it is also filled with this cottony mycelial filling. So probably starting to see a theme here. Cut your mushroom in half and see what it looks like. So on to the gyromitras. So these are big old fleshy fungi. These can be, a couple of pounds when you find these. They're also not very common in our area, and there are some people who eat them, but they have hydrazines in them. They have something in them called gyromitrin, and it breaks down to hydrazines, and that monomethylhydrazine is a rocket fuel. And I certainly don't want to be eating that. It's very volatile, and so oftentimes this will be boiled off. It'll be in the steam of it being cooked, and you can even breathe that in, and it can affect you. So a lot of it might volatilize off, but who knows if some's still left in that tissue. And you may recall that fungi in the news saying that they're not sure that maybe this gyromitrin may be contributing to cases of ALS. And I certainly wouldn't want to get that for just eating a mushroom. Still a fun find if you do find them. Unfortunately, you can't really eat it. But anyway, chop them in half, and you'll see it is not hollow inside. It has these chambers and cross tissue all through here. If you see the cap, it is also not really aligned in pits and ridges. It's almost more brain-like and wavy, and it's just lots of folds and wrinkles, and it looks kind of crazy. Not very common. I did just get someone sent me a note. They found a gyromitra. It was only a partial picture of a cap. I couldn't tell what it was. And I don't encounter these very often, not traveling around. So in this area, you don't see them too often. All right, so that was one of the bigger, more common ones that we may find here. But there are a number of gyromitras. So there's already one that started fruiting here. There's this Corfie. There's Esculenta, which you saw the other picture was much better resolution than this one is, and Brunea. And Brunea is probably the one I've found the most in this area. You can see it's very often it has this almost saddle shape with the brainy cap tissue like that. This isn't a picture of the one I found, but the one I found had a very similar shape to it. And I think once you start learning your morels and the pits and the ridges, you'll see, yeah, that is not pits and ridges for sure. So, but you can see how they can have a very similar resemblance. If you were to cut all four of these mushrooms in half, the only one that would be pure hollow would be this true morel right here. I also found this slide or this little image that these guys had made, and it's a great shot of how variable the coloration on these guys can be. So you've got browns and reds and oranges and yellows, but even in the same species, they can be very multicolored. And but anyway, there are some other mushrooms that can have a passing resemblance. You may look at this one and go, boy, that looks like pits and ridges. But um, if you find this is actually an older one, and this fly is kind of telling because this thing, when it still had its gleba on it, was quite smelly. So this is actually a stinkhorn. And if its gleba gets washed off, whether in the rain or whatever, then then it's gonna look more morel-like. Now you'll notice that this cap is also overhanging, so it is not attached to the stike. They're also growing from kind of like an egg sac, so they emerge from this. And so if you did find some stinkhorn like that, I think you'd be able to tell eventually. Not to mention these are actually edible, so it wouldn't kill you if you did eat it. The Halvellas can look vaguely similar to morels, uh, but they tend not to fruit around at the same time. And so if you do find something like this a little bit later in the year and you think it's a morel, um, it's good to have this on mind to know, okay, yeah, that's actually a Helvella. So they've got this more brainy cap as well. Often the stike is much more ridged and such. Of course, when you're out there hunting, there's going to be a lot of things to trick your eye. So one thing that is starting to grow at this time of year is something called cancer root. It's actually called that because it's tapping into nutrients from the oak trees. Magnolia cones can fool you. This is probably a sugar magnolia and not necessarily one of the native Virginiana type magnolias, but they also have these pits. Sometimes you see them on the ground and they can fool you. This was a pine cone someone had found and they thought it was a morel, and I could see why. I've also seen sweet gum balls that can look like this. And then this here is a good shot of the tulip poplar seed pod. And so we're going to be hunting in tulip poplar woods more often than not here. And there's going to be a number of these, and sometimes they can draw your eye thinking you might have found a mushroom. And so the last thing I'll mention is the black locust. And not because they are necessarily something that will grow, that it's an indicator that morels are growing there. But for me, these are one of the indicators of the end of the morel season. So uh, black locusts have very, very thick, ropey bark like this. I thought this image was nice because it actually has the Pholinus robineae, which is a very common mushroom growing from black locust trunks. They have these compound leaves as well, and they've got these beautiful clusters of flowers. And oftentimes you'll see them growing on the side of the road when you're driving. And so if you're driving down the road, the highway, and you start seeing something like this, then you know, I think morel season's about to be done. So it's not necessarily when they're out, it's done, it's over. There could be morels still out there. Some might be starting to decay away, but you might be able to find something. But that is definitely one of the things that indicate that the season is coming to an end. All right, and I only have a couple slides of pictures that people have sent me. So Scott sent me this. Polypores, hopefully you guys will start finding new stuff and sending them in, and we'll be able to start seeing some fleshy fungi. but these are from a month or so ago, and so not much has been happening. And you can see, flipping it over, it's got the what look like gills. These are actually elongated pores. And you can see that this cluster is much more vibrant and colorful. This is probably a fresher cluster. And he found these in a different spot and was wondering if they were the same. And he did have a shot of the underside and it did have the gills. So I told him that looks like Trinity's betulite from multicolored gill polygon. And Jim Stratton sent this in from North Carolina, another polypore, Ganoderma Verticea, maybe. But anyway, I hope we can all find a nice little cluster like this. I had mentioned that I found a number of mushrooms and had a picture here of what I thought was something fruiting under an old dead elm trunk. And this is an image from there. So I hope all you are out there are able to find at least a little cluster like this or two.